Okay, let's talk about environment and the influences environment have on increasing your risk for getting cancers. Some of this we've kind of talked about before. So how do we know there's a gene-environment interaction? There are a couple ways that we know. We can do it in the lab, or we can actually do it by doing studies from the past. So I mentioned earlier about the Japanese studies where if you're Japanese lineage woman, you have lower chance of breast cancer living in Japan. But if you take that same lineage and you bring that person to the United States and raise them in our lifestyle or our environment, it increases the risk of breast cancer. Same thing with Japanese men and prostate cancer. So if they're born in Japan, they're Japanese lineage, they have lower risk of prostate cancer, but you bring that Japanese born in lineage person to the United States and raise them here, and it increases their risk of prostate cancer. Same thing with even the BRCA gene. People that were living in the United States before 1940 had the BRCA gene, but they found that people, if you were living in the United States before 1940 and you had the BRCA gene, you had about a 24% chance of getting breast cancer if you were over the age of 50. However, in the new millennium, 2000s, they found that if you had the same gene but you're living in the same area of the United States, you actually have about a 67% risk of having the breast cancer if you were born in newer millenniums like in the 1980s and 1990s. Just even testicular cancer went up. So it went up to 75% or a 75% increase from 1970 to 1980 just by living in the same regions in the United States. So there's something else about the environment than just living here. It's something about this changing or evolving in the environment too. There are also cures. So we found the H. pylori that we found caused stomach cancers. There's a huge drop since we've identified the H. pylori and treated it. So there are a lot of things, giving treatments, looking at the environments, looking at the genetics of people, looking at cancer in lab rats. So I remember my mom used to chew, I think it was Trident gum. I think it was Trident. But I remember looking at the side of it, it said that the products in this gum have been shown to cause cancer in lab rats in California. And I always thought, well, geez, I'm glad I'm not a lab rat in California. But what's strange is even though you put the label on the side, it didn't stop us from chewing the gum. Think about cigarette smoking. We still do it. So we found these things have definite links to our environment or things we put in our bodies. So there's genetics and lifestyle, and it's an influence of both. Even obesity increases the chance of cancer, as you can see in the bottom here. So viruses, obesity. Viruses can cause obesity. Obesity can cause cancer. It's a huge link. It's so complex. Right? I love this quote, genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger, because basically you're born with good or not so good genes. What you do with your life from that point on is actually where the biggest influence is. So there's a link between genetics and cancer-prone families. There are genes that are passed on that either make you more susceptible or decrease your resistance to certain diseases. If you put yourself in a bad environment, it's going to increase your likelihood of getting a cancer. So things like the BRCA or BRCA gene, it increases the risk of getting cancer. So what do you want to do? Do you want to go out and smoke a bunch of cigarettes and be obese and all that stuff? No, you need to watch your diet, you need to take care of yourself, and it'll reduce your risk. Is there any guarantee you're not going to get a cancer? No. It just reduces your risk by living appropriate lifestyles. It increases your risk of getting cancer by having bad genes or having a bad lifestyle. So it's the mix of the two. Being exposed to mutagens, whether you have a bad gene or not. If it affects the somatic cell, it's going to affect you. It affects mutations in your body. If it affects your germline, like if you're getting zapped with x-rays in the gonad region, it's going to affect your germline. You're going to pass those flaws on to your kids. So there's definitely a heritable trait there. And then, of course, we talked about epigenetics several times, but you can tell getting good genes, you may actually have epigenetic changes that still cause problems. So here are the main environmental factors we're going to talk about. And all of these things on this list have been proven to be carcinogens, which means they generate carcinomas, cancers. Right? So, of course, right on the top of the list is tobacco use, just because tobacco has so many different carcinogens and clastogens and mutagens in it, they can cause problems. And people think, well, geez, it's going to cause lung cancer, but they're actually, well, they're part right. They're not completely right. It can cause lots of cancers. So all the way down the GI tract and the respiratory system and the reproductive system, everywhere in their body. And we'll talk about those too. So here are the main sections, and you can see over here to the side, one of the biggest ones is your diet, and then tobacco right along with it. So great, you're not a smoker, but what kind of food do you put in your body? How clean do you eat, so to say? Right, and then your work environment, viruses, things like sunlight or UV radiation, we'll talk about those. So tobacco first, of course. And tobacco, it's interesting because we've been smoking tobacco for hundreds of years. But the original study that they actually determined that it was a carcinogen was when they took the chemicals in the tobacco smoke and they liquefied them, and they took this little paintbrush and they painted it on the back of mice. No, they don't have some mice smoke cigarettes, but they actually shaved the back of the mouse and they painted these chemicals onto the back of a mouse. And they took another mouse and they painted, a placebo on the back of it. And what they found is that the mice that they painted tobacco chemicals on the back of had a higher increased risk of cancers. And it wasn't just skin cancer, it was also other cancers in the body. Because tobacco gets in you and it travels everywhere. So everywhere that's exposed to tobacco has an increased risk of a cancer. So think about it. When you bring in the tobacco, you're bringing it through your lungs, but it hits the mucosal layer. So it goes all the way down your GI tract. It penetrates in your GI tract and goes through your bloodstream. Well, where's everything that you absorb in your bloodstream go first? Almost everything. To the liver. So these toxins go right to the liver to try and get cleaned and detoxified. So you see a higher rate of liver cancers, bloodborne cancers, you see a higher risk of skin cancers, every kind of cancer when you're talking about tobacco, because it gets in you, on you, and all over you. And what it does is it goes in and it changes the DNA sequence. It's a mutagen. It mutates the DNA, and if it causes a cancer, they call it a carcinogen. So a mutagen can be a carcinogen, but it doesn't have to be. It's kind of like the term tumor in cancer. All cancers are forms of tumors, but not all tumors are cancers. So a carcinogen is a form of a mutagen, but not all mutagens are carcinogens. Right? So you can see the different areas, basically all the way through your body. So organs that have to clean this stuff up and get rid of it, organs that have exposure to the GI tract, all over the place. Right? So once these things penetrate the body through the lung or the intestines, they go everywhere. And you can see a short list of some of the things they're in. So there are like 250 chemicals inside of a cigarette smoke that are considered toxic. And you can see things like acetone, so think fingernail polish remover. I'm trying to look at insecticides. That's awesome. Arsenic, so it's incredible. These things that we're smoking and bringing in. Carbon monoxide, you're familiar with what it does to the body. So your first homework for this section is actually homework number 6, and it's one of not just lung cancer is a common cancer that's associated with smoking, but another common cancer associated with smoking is actually acute myeloid leukemia. So I'm going to have you look this up, and this is actually kind of an interesting disorder. So you're going to find out what it is. So how does it happen in etiology? What's the incidence of it? What cells in the body are being affected? So what part of the body is it being affected? And I kind of put a picture over here that hint to what's going on. So where do they accumulate at? And then what are the symptoms of it? And what's the 5-year survival rate of somebody that has AML? So I'm going to have you look those things up. And it's kind of cool over here when you take a blood sample of somebody with AML. I'm saying cool as in it's interesting. How's that? It's a better word. But they call it hyperleukocytosis, which means they have more leukocytes than a normal person. And you can see this buffy layer. If you remember blood, you've got the plasma, you get the real thin buffy layer, and then you have the hematocrit, or the red blood cells. But this hyperleukocytosis means too many leukocytes, so way too many. What's interesting about this is it actually has kind of a green color to it. And you don't have to memorize this, but it's an interesting fun fact. So it's actually called myeloperoxidase that's released from those white blood cells that gives it the green color. It's this chemical that's being released by the white blood cells that are attacking things. And they're in your blood releasing it to attack. You can see the same thing when you have a cold and you get that thick, green, snotty mucus. It's because the white blood cells are releasing this myeloperoxidase into the environment to try and kill infections. So it's this iron-containing enzyme that gives this green reflective appearance. So it's kind of a fun fact. But you can pause, write down the homework assignment, do that, and we'll come back. All right, next, can alcohol increase cancer risk? Sure can. Yeah, so alcohol, what you really want to remember is it's a solvent. It's a solvent. When you take in something like cigarette smoke, the cigarette smoke goes in your lungs and a lot of it's blown out. And then a lot of the other toxins are actually cleared by the mucociliary escalator that carries up the debris so you can cough it out. But when you smoke and you drink alcohol, the alcohol will help bind the cigarette toxins and actually transport them across your cell membranes and into your blood. So if you have that friend that says, oh, I only smoke when I drink, well, you're twice the idiot, right? Well, I shouldn't say that. They're both idiots. If you're smoking, you're a moron. So if you're smoking and you're drinking alcohol, it's helping transport the toxins in faster. So it's bringing those carcinogens into your body even quicker. And then that's the connection between smoking and alcohol. But alcohol itself, chronic alcoholism or chronic exposure to alcohol can actually do a lot more damage too without cigarette smoke. Like, it causes lipid peroxidation. We talked about these things the first week of class when we talked about damage to cells. So you get this lipid peroxidation. It breaks down the membranes or destabilizes the membranes of all your cells, no matter what cell it is. Brain cells, GI cells, cardiac cells, all of the cells. It destabilizes the membrane. Right? It also goes into the DNA, and it acts kind of like an epigenetic form. The ethanol can get in and cause changes in the DNA so that genes aren't expressed appropriately. Right? So it can alter methylation, which is epigenetics. And then you can see once it gets in and causes the changes genetically, it can cause the increased risk of mutations. It can cause damage to things like Kupffer cells, which are inside your liver. So it starts damaging all of these tissues. Your body doesn't want to respond appropriately. It doesn't want to make the proper genes, and then it starts falling apart. You increase the risk of mutations, which increases the risk of cancers. So you just want to be careful. And they say that, you know, one drink of alcohol or one drink a day is good for you because of the chemicals that are in it. Some of that, like, they're like resveratrols. I can't remember the exact name for it, but they're really good because they're antioxidants. But too much is a bad thing. So even that breakdown product, acetaldehyde, can get in and cause toxic behaviors. And then the next one, xenobiotics. And xenobiotics are living compounds that are changed. So they were in some other organism typically, like an animal or a plant. And when you cook them or you heat them, you change their structure. So here's an example. Here you have some phenylalanine, which you probably heard of before, some creatinine. So this is in your meat. These are amino acids. Here you have that creatinine that's important for energy storage in the muscle. And then when you cook it, you denaturate, you change it, you actually turn them into these aromatic compounds. So they call them polycycloaromatic hydrocarbons or heterocyclic amines. They change the form, and basically your body doesn't process them so well. And they start sticking to things. And they can get into the cell and start altering the DNA. So when you're having your cookout, as soon as you heat this grill up over around 392 degrees, you start changing the form of these proteins, which makes the food delicious. But that charring, that's kind of an excess. And that charring actually changes it into these things called xenobiotics that can become toxic. So they get into your body, and then you push them over to the liver. Remember everything that comes in through the GI tract. And then the liver has to break them down and excrete them. But your liver only has a certain amount of enzymes to help process it. So when you take in excessive amounts, they start building up, they accumulate, they can cause liver damage, they can cause damage to all kinds of different cells. So increase your cancer risk. So the normal process is you bring them in, your liver processes them and breaks them down and helps you clear them. A lot of times it'll make it more water soluble and then you urinate them out. But where these come from are cooking animal products or meats that have a lot of phenylalanine or a lot of creatinine in them, or creatine in them. So you change the compounds and they stick in you. And we've known about these things since like the 1970s. So the NIH published a paper back in the 70s talking about how bad it was and how much it changed your DNA level. But nobody listens because, well, the meat's so delicious. So the last three slides really kind of talk about three things you bring into your body, and they all had a theme in common, is that they both revolve around, or all three revolve around the liver and detoxification. And I'm not going to go into like a pharmacology explanation and all of that, but your liver has a three-step process where it takes in the toxins, it uses enzymes and minerals and nutrients to break down these toxins and make them less toxic. And then eventually it pushes out in the blood, and then you can eliminate either into the bile or through the kidneys and the urine. So it's a breakdown process. What makes you different than the person sitting next to you is the type of genes you have. So it may not be exactly the one specific type, but more like the abundance. Like we talked about fast flush syndrome, where people with Asian heritage don't make the proper enzymes to break down alcohol. Same idea. Well, you may have different levels of enzymes that are really good at detoxifying. So you bring in cigarette smoke and toxins, you eat your burger charbroiled, and you drink like a fish, and you still don't get cancers. I mean, flukes like that do happen, and it's based on how well your body detoxifies. So why not everybody that smokes gets cancers revolves around how good their body is at detoxifying those bad things, those bad chemicals. Another factor is diet. Remember, you can see all the important things. You take these in. So folic acid, the B vitamins, different amino acids, All of these things you take in that help you break down other bad products. One thing they found is really good for your diet is actually omega-3s, and those are plant fats. So these aren't like animal fats. Fats are usually omega-6 or omega-9, which are really sticky fats. These are really good, like fluidy fats. And what they find is it goes through it helps bind to these toxins and helps clear them from your system. So it makes it a little bit easier on your body. I'm not suggesting go out and drink a bottle of olive oil before you eat a charbroiled steak, but it's just that the omega-3s actually increase your ability to handle toxins. There's a lot of studies, and you can go to the National Cancer Society or the National Cancer Institute and look up research that's been done on taking certain vitamins and supplements and all that and what it does for detoxification or cancer reduction. But you'll find that a lot of the hype out there on, oh, you've got to take a lot of C vitamin or B vitamins and it makes it better. Your body only handles those so well, so it doesn't really make a big impact. Well, omega-3s actually have been proven to be significant in reducing the risk of toxins that cause cancer. And of course, lifestyle can change it too. So if you're an exerciser, if you have low exposure to these things, that can also change your risk of getting cancers because of things you bring in your body, like smoke and alcohol and charred burgers. Delicious. Okay, so how does sex increase the risk of cancer? So reproductive behavior introduces two possible things that are dangerous to you. One's bacteria and one's a virus. So bacteria come in, and what they do is they trigger something called an inflammatory response, which increases mutations in DNA. And we'll talk about that in a few slides. But let's talk about viruses right now. So viral STDs like HIV or a human papillomavirus, HPV, those things, they get in. A virus, its goal is to get into your cells and change the DNA. Well, when they change the DNA, they're inducing a mutation. So one of the ones we'll talk about now is actually HPV, human papillomavirus. And this is a virus that causes things like genital warts. So Condyloma acuminata sounds almost like a fruity tropical drink, but you definitely don't want to order that drink because that's genital warts. And genital warts, they're ugly on the surface, but genital warts, if you have HPV, can actually be a warning sign that you have mutations going on inside your body. And there are a couple of different forms of HPV. There are like 200 and some forms, but there are a couple of forms that are known carcinogens or carcinogenic, like number 16, 18, and 31. And those are the ones that they base the vaccine off of. And I'm having a brain fart on the name of the vaccine right now. But that's what they base it on, is to try and prevent the risk of cervical cancers. So here's how they create cervical cancer. So they're called oncogenic viruses because they can cause cancers. What they do is every virus, its main goal is to insert genes. So the virus is here and it comes cruising along, and then it gets into your cells, and what it's going to do is it's going to infect those cells. It gets way down in here and plants its DNA inside those deep stem-like cells, so stem cells. And then when they replicate, all of the replications are infected. They replicate the DNA from this virus over and over and over again. So then eventually, because of these mutations, they can start becoming cancers. And then, of course, those cancers can become malignant, and then they can metastasize and cause lots of problems. So it's kind of a step-by-step process. The virus injects its DNA into your DNA, which causes the mutation. That mutation is replicated every time you replicate a cell until you start replacing all those cells, and then those cells can get out of control. Right? So there are a couple different types of viruses. You can have DNA or RNA viruses, which means that, let's say this is a DNA virus like HPV, human papillomavirus. That actually has its own DNA and injects it into you. But HIV is more sneaky. HIV has an RNA virus. Now, if you remember, the central dogma is DNA to RNA to proteins. Well, this thing takes its RNA, injects it into your cell, and then it turns that RNA into DNA, and then injects it into your nucleus and into your genome. And we'll talk about HIV later when we talk about infections, but this is just kind of a general overview. Right. So viruses associated with cancer, here are some of the biggies. These are the main ones that you're going to find are associated with cancers, like hepatitis. So hepatitis B and C, they're viruses. They get in, they go down into the cells, they cause changes. And what organ do they typically affect? The liver. Yep. So they affect the liver, and they increase the risk of liver cancers. Epstein-Barr virus is interesting because it's actually the same virus that causes mono. Yeah. So it gets in, it's a virus though. It changes your DNA, and it likes to go after B lymphocytes, so it can actually cause different forms of leukemia. We'll talk about that too. So lymphomas and leukemias. And then Kaposi sarcoma, this thing goes hand in hand with HIV. So here's an example of what Kaposi sarcoma is. Kaposi's affects endothelial cells, so blood vessel cells. It makes them weak. And then here you can see all these little capillary regions where the capillaries are weak and then they start bursting. So you see all these little blood blisters underneath the skin. And this thing is sneaky because it hides right along with HIV. When somebody's infected with HIV, they usually get Kaposi's at the same time. So, and we'll talk about that more again with HIV. And then the next one, human papillomavirus. I already talked about it several times. If this is the cervix, then you can see the virus gets in during sex or however it gets in. It affects the cells. The cell's DNA changes, starts making all these replicas, gets out of control, starts over-replicating. Mutations happen until it finally becomes cancerous, and then you can see all these stem cells. And that's where the risk is. And of course, Pap smears are there to help identify it. And this last one is HTLV, and it's the human T-cell leukemia lymphoma virus. And this is an interesting one because when we talk about it, we usually talk about being transmitted vertically or horizontally. Vertically means you inherited it. So your parents got this virus, and when they made the gametes, they made your gamete with the virus already. So you inherited it. Horizontal means you got it from another person from some other form. So horizontal, they could have gotten it from mom through breastfeeding. You could get it through sexual intercourse. You could get it through blood transfusions. But that's what we mean by inherited vertically or getting it horizontally. Right? So while we're on that topic, oops, I skipped right over it. Let's go to the next homework question, homework number 7. So this one, I put the pathway together, and all you have to do is plug in the blanks. So you can look up Burkitt's lymphoma. Whether you want to look it up in your textbook or you look it up online, that's fine. But here, I want you to tell me what are the causes. So what are some of the causes for number 1? And then what type of cell does it affect? So what's the cell that's being affected in Burkitt's lymphoma? The third thing I want you to do is, does it tell you a gene that's primarily affected? And if so, what did that gene do? And I kind of slipped and I put the chromosome with everything on it. But so what genes affected? Was it one of those accelerators? Was it one of those brakes or repair? And please don't write the word brake, accelerator, repair. Write down it's a tumor suppressor gene. It was an oncogen. So write down exactly what it did. And then what tissue is involved? And here's actually a solid tumor, Burkitt's lymphoma tumor, that was extracted from the person. Right? So what happened, and then what tissue involved? And then what are the symptoms of this lymphoma? And I'd really like it if you actually put like the survival rate down too. I put this in for a reason because you've already learned these steps or this process, and now you're just applying it. So if you can use terms like the incidence and the mortality and the survival rate when you talk about cancers, that's all the more beneficial. All right, so go ahead and pause it, write down what you need to, and we'll come back. All right, how can bacteria cause cancers? So bacteria can cause cancers in a couple ways. They can release toxins, and those toxins can cause damage to your DNA. They can act like clastogens and break the chromosomes. They can cause mutations. Another common cause for bacteria causing cancer is actually through an inflammatory process. So one example is H. pylori, so Helicobacter pylori, which is associated with stomach mucosa infections. And here's actually the lining of the stomach. And then you can see here are all these little tiny H. pylori bacteria that are invading the stomach lining. So here's how they work. They get in. What's interesting about them is they actually have a protective layer. Remember, the stomach's very acidic, so they put up this alkaline barrier around themselves, and they penetrate down through the acidity. And then when they get down there and they get to the epithelial cells, then they start releasing chemicals to eat the wall of the cells. So here you can see the environment, the acidic environment, and they actually make an ammonia barrier around them. So remember, a base neutralizes the acid. And then when it gets to that wall, it starts eating at the wall, penetrating the wall. They all start teaming up and they get in. Well, as soon as they start penetrating through, they're damaging the cells, so you get this inflammatory response. Your immune system starts bringing in all these inflammatory mediators, like the white blood cells, and they start releasing all these toxins to try and kill things. Well, now you've got this collateral damage, and you're destroying all of the cells around here. So that leads to things like ulcers. You destroy the cell tissue here, and then suddenly that acid can seep down and start eating your own wall of your GI tract. Another thing that happens, the inflammatory response inside of cells turns up a reactive oxygen species. The reactive oxygen species already know destroy the cell membrane, they destroy the DNA. They can create mutations or breaks in the DNA too. So it's kind of a step-by-step process. By them, any kind of invader, bacteria invading, turns up inflammatory response, which makes lots of free radicals, reactive oxygen species. Right? So here's an example. This is what H. pylori look like. There's one cell, and you can see the process. They start releasing these chemicals, these toxins that can actually affect your nucleus, or your own free radicals from your white blood cells can come in. So either way, they change the DNA and can cause cancers. All right. Next, can your job kill you or cause cancer? Sure, they call them occupational hazards, right? So there are lots of different things, whether you're working with asbestos, and this is a little block of asbestos. You can see all these little tiny fine particles, and these particles are like little tiny microscopic splinters. And when you breathe them in, they get in the air and you inhale them, you can't get rid of them. You don't have any process for getting rid of them. They spike into the wall of your lungs and they stick there. And then your immune system comes along, and I love this picture because it's showing a white blood cell trying to eat. So it tries to eat that asbestos splinter, and it actually got speared and killed. So you can't get rid of it. So the best thing your body can do is build up these walls around it, and then, you know, as you're thickening the walls in your lungs, you're making it harder to breathe. But you can do the similar functions where it triggers an inflammatory response, free radicals, and destruction. And so you've probably heard of cancers that are caused by job-related, situations like mesothelioma. If you ever heard those ambulance chasing commercials like, "Have you been exposed to asbestos? Well, has anyone in your family had mesothelioma?" And they tell you all about it, and they say, "Come see us because we're going to sue the pants off your former employer and get lots of money for you." Well, what they're forgetting to tell you is they're actually going to get lots of money for them and give you a little bit. But these are just examples, and I'm not getting into the whole legal background. But things like rubber dyes, paints, things that are lipid soluble that can go right into your body or seep into your body, even heavy metals like mercury, they can seep into your body. So toxins in the environment can go in and cause damage. Radioactive gases like radon, we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Right? But a lot of these workers that have worked around radon or some of these like chemical invaders, they get a lot of leukemias because it penetrates into your body, into your blood, goes to the bone marrow and affects the bone marrow cells. Right? One example here of mesothelioma, this is interesting because most cases actually appear about 15 years after you're exposed, so it's not something that pops up right away. And here you can see some pieces or some fragments of the asbestos inside the lung tissue. But your body tries to build up barriers. It tries to block off the lung tissue so that it doesn't have any problems. Here's another example of that sphere, and you can see the lung tissue around it. Here you can see the damage, all these little granulomas, and what actually could end up turning into caseous necrosis. The little clots with the fluid pockets around it. And then here you can see mesothelioma, so all the cancer tissue. But it's just progression. So tobacco exposure increases the risk. It's not like an additive effect where you get a little mesothelioma and a little tobacco and they just add together. They actually are synergistic. So it's far greater than an additive response. So it's like when you talk about hormones, where you put a little of this and a little of that together, you get an unusually large response. That's the way smoking is with asbestos and these other chemicals. You get more than just an additive response. You get like an logarithmic or exponential response, I guess is a better way to describe it. And then a lot of mesothelioma actually affects the pleura. And most of these cases you'll actually see 30 years after they worked in the environment, then they show signs of mesothelioma. Right. Oh, I forgot to mention. So it affects the pleura, affects everything. So not just the alveoli, but everything around the lungs. Right. So what types of radiation can affect me? And radiation, we're exposed to it all the time. UV, ultraviolet light's radiation, so UVA, UVB radiation. It releases an inflammatory response in your skin. So free radicals released in the skin. It affects different cells like the basal cells. It can affect the pigment cells, so the melanocytes. When it changes their DNA, it changes the way they grow, and you usually see outgrowths, or if it's a melanocyte, you see a darker color. And we'll talk about these when we talk about skin later too, and types of skin cancer. Which reminds me, when we talk about specific systems, I'll come back and talk about cancers that specifically affect that system, and you'll have to remember these types of causes later down the road. And then ionizing radiation, basically these change the molecular structure of atoms inside your body. So here you see a lot of like inflammation response, DNA damage. Here you actually see at the atomic level just shattering. When you get zapped with an X-ray, it goes through. When it hits the DNA, it just shatters pieces of DNA. Right? So when you look at radiation, you can see different levels. So everything from radio waves to microwaves and cell phones fall right in here. So infrared waves, invisible light, these things can all change you. And a little bit more powerful, here they get a little bit faster and more dangerous. Ultraviolet light, and then X-rays, and then ionizing rays. But here you can see different levels of exposure that we're getting constantly. So what level of exposure do you get when you get a CT scan or a full body scan? What level of exposure do you get when you get X-rays and stuff like that? So it's interesting. So the immediate effects, when you get overexposed, you might have intestinal lining destruction, skin cells, bone cells, like blood cells. What's interesting about all of these are rapidly replicating cells. When you damage them, they don't rapidly replicate, so you see flaws. We'll talk about that when we talk about symptoms of cancer. But later, because of the DNA damage, when you're replicating those cells, then you see a lot of lingering effects, which brings me to the next question. So you're going to look up a couple of these ionizing radiation situations, and this isn't a tough one. But back in the 1950s, the government really started looking more extensively into the long-term effects of radiation because we had just dropped nuclear bombs, right? So we wanted to worry about what was the fallout or what was the reaction afterwards. What kind of damage would that do to people long-term, not just immediate effects? So what's interesting is the X-rays. The original X-ray techs would actually hold the X-ray plates and they get scanned several times a day, and they find that there was kind of a correlation between certain cancers and people that were exposed over 50 times a day to these X-rays. So what you want to do is you want to Google or search for what happened to those original X-ray techs. So what were the major diseases that they endured? So what kind of major diseases did they endure? What you'll find is that there are huge effects to things like their bone cells in their finger and their skin cells in their fingers. But you can do a search. Probably the best way to do it is actually look up National Cancer Institute website, and then they have statistics section, and you can even search inside of there for X-ray radiation. So there are just some things you can look for. And it's interesting because you'll find there are a couple types of cancers that are common in those people. And the next thing is ionizing radiation. So Hiroshima, Chernobyl, back in the 1980s, Chernobyl was in Russia. There was a crack in a nuclear generator, and it leaked lots of radiation all over the place. Hiroshima, you probably heard, we dropped a big bomb there, and it caused lots of radiation to be exposed all across Japan. And even some, guiding across into China and stuff. So look that up, and what were the two most common cancers that you find associated with nuclear fallouts like these two? Right? After you've looked at this, what are the two parts of the body, other than the gonads, that are usually susceptible to absorbing radiation? So when you look at these two cancers, they tell you about two special areas of the body that are really susceptible to cancers, or radiation-caused cancers. And so what did you notice was the theme? So just pause, do a search. Remember, the more keywords you do in your search, the easier your source is going to be. All right. And now radon. So radon's a gas, and we kind of just blow it off, no pun intended. So we kind of blow it off as it's not that dangerous, but in reality, radon is extremely dangerous. What radon is in parts of the world where your homes or your employment or whatever is built over large deposits of uranium starts breaking down. As it breaks down, we call it decayed, and it turns into radium. And then when radium decays, it turns into radon. And radon's a gas, invisible, odorless, colorless. It floats up in through the basement of buildings. So foundation of your workplace or the foundation of your house that seeps up in. And they're usually not well ventilated, so this radon accumulates down in that enclosed area. And then when you go down there, you get exposed to it. When it slowly leaks up, when you turn your furnace on, you get exposed to high levels of it, because not a lot of people will actually keep their windows open anymore. So all these chemicals in the internal environment of the house stay in there. But if you look, in Iowa and Illinois, we're actually in high radon areas. Radon gets in, it causes DNA damage, and it causes cancers. It was interesting because I actually got a chance to meet a person that she had an entire lung removed. She never smoked. She didn't do anything that we'd consider a risk for a lung cancer. And when she had her house tested, she had high levels of radon. And she actually sent me kind of like a bloodhound out looking at this. And she said that radon actually killed more people in Iowa than drunk driving in Iowa. So if you look overall across the nation, drunk driving, look at how many people are killed a year. It looks like about 15,000, roughly, almost 20,000 people by drunk driving. But radon, look at the high level of radon, probably 13,000 across the country. drownings, fire, airline crashes. So it's way safer to fly or run through a house fire, I guess, than to live in a house with radon. It's the moral of the story there. Right, and then your cell phone. This is kind of a controversial one, but is your cell phone actually killing you? Your cell phone, when you look at that ionizing radiation, here you have X-rays, here you have a tanning booth, so UV light. You have microwaves, and your cell phone's right there. So your cell phone you're putting right up to your head. Do you really want to sit and stare at the microwave? No, I mean, it freaks me out just doing it. But they're finding that cell phones actually put off radiation and affect blood vessels in your brain. So talking on the cell phone with it held up to your head a lot actually can cause some changes. Are they carcinogenic? We don't really know yet. But you'd think if they were highly carcinogenic, since cell phones are more common now than they were 15 years ago, you'd see more brain cancers now, like a proportional risk increasing. We really don't see that. So there are dangers to putting cell phones up to your head for a long amount of times, but what's their carcinogenic effects, we're really not sure yet. Right? And then let's talk about obesity. Obesity is linked to cancer. So there's a correlation between high body mass index and cancer rates. And what I really want you to look at is this chemical called leptin. So leptin is released by adipose tissue. When you fill up your adipose tissue, you release leptin. Leptin's primary goal is actually to go up to the brain until the brain stops eating. It goes to the hypothalamus to quit eating. But leptin's a hormone. It travels all through your body, and we're finding it has more effects. Leptin will actually go to other fat cells and tell them, start storing extra fat. It acts like a hormone. It starts regulating these storage centers. It starts directing blood vessels to grow in these adipose areas. So it says, man, these fat cells are so full, let's release leptin and bring blood vessels in so we can add this extra storage. And you know that when you get fatter, you have to increase the length of blood vessels to get nutrients to all that fat tissue. So we do know it stimulates angiogenesis. And remember, angiogenesis is one of those key players in cancers. So if you have mutated cells and you have a lot of excess adipose tissue and you're releasing leptin, it's like putting fertilizer on these mutated cells. So it increases the rate of growth in these mutated cells. Leptin promotes inflammation. We saw with H. pylori, inflammation releases free radicals that also cause mutations in cancers. So leptin promotes cancers in that way. Leptin has paracrine and autocrine cells. Paracrine because it affects its neighbors. It goes next door to the neighbors and says, hey, let's increase that angiogenesis. But it also has autocrine, which means the release of leptin stimulates more release of leptin. Think about this. If you had a breast cancer cell that was an adipose cell and it's releasing leptin, now it's autocrine. Now it's releasing more of that same hormone into your system. So that one breast cancer cell will actually increase the activity of more breast cancer cells. So it proliferates more and more and more. So you can see all these cascading effects. And then while we're on the topic of hormones, exogenous hormones. And this is kind of a controversial topic too. So hormones that are out in the environment, they're not necessarily hormones. A lot of times we'll call them phytohormones or exogenous hormones. You eat them. Like when you eat soybeans, you actually eat phytoestrogens. So estrogens that the soybean product makes. It's in your system, and it works similar to hormones in your system. So it mimics things like estrogens. Well, here's the problem. So breast cancer. Breast tissue is estrogen sensitive. So if you have a breast cancer and you put more estrogen in your system, you're actually feeding that cancer and stimulating it to grow. So these cells have estrogen receptors. They sense the estrogen, they increase their activity, they increase the replication, the proliferation, they make new cells. Those new cells can actually stimulate themselves to grow. It's a positive feedback loop, remember? Those are dangerous. So these hormones can actually trigger increase. When you take in phytoestrogens or plant estrogens, they increase the activity of some of these cells. Now, I'm not trying to dissuade you from eating soybeans or anything like that. It's just you have to be conscious sometimes of the chemicals that are out there. There are other chemicals out there called endocrine disruptors, like BPAs and plastic and stuff like that, that affect these receptors. They can stimulate the growth of cancers. I put this little chart here because I'm talking about breast cancer, but similar with prostate cancer. Here you have a feedback loop. So I borrowed this slide from a paper from the Annals of Internal Medicine. It was risk factors for prostate cancer, and I thought this was an awesome slide because they show the hypothalamus to the pituitary and then down to the testis. So you see that loop. But what we don't usually think about is that loop also affects the prostate. So when you release chemicals like testosterone goes out and goes to places like the prostate. So testosterone acts on the prostate a lot like estrogen acts on the breast cancer. So men that are taking testosterone supplements or testosterone steroids are overstimulating the prostate, which could actually increase the rate of development of prostate cancers. So just keep in mind some of those feedback loops and what's going on there. So I put another homework question here. I want you to actually look into this a little bit. So I want you to find 4 specific sources of hormone-like chemicals that you're exposed to every day. Whether it's things like pesticides or phytochemicals or whatever, just find 4 examples. And you can just Google whatever you need to find them. And then, other than cancers, what kind of problems may they actually cause? So you can always use this slide back here and kind of look back at some of the processes. So it may be things like pharmaceuticals, like some drugs that may mimic hormones, like maybe birth control pills, and now you can't use that one. Some household cleaning products, some other things that are like dissolvents or solvents that dissolve things. And like I said, BPAs. But just find 4 and write them down. So pause, and we only have 2 slides left here. All right, so physical activity. This doesn't cause cancer. This actually decreases the risk of cancer. So what they find is that walking, exercise, it decreases insulin and insulin-like growth factors. So insulin and insulin-like growth factors are kind of like, well, they're kind of like fertilizer on cancer cells again. So they stimulate growth. Walking actually decreases the insulin. It burns the sugar right away so you don't release so much. Obesity, walking decreases obesity. So go back to the obesity slide and look at all the things you turn off. Walking helps you flush out reactive oxygen species, helps decrease inflammation, helps increase your gut motility. So it helps you move toxins through your GI tract so they have less time to absorb. Which brings me to fiber. You want to eat fiber because it scrapes all those toxins out of your GI tract. It's like using a bottle brush through your GI tract when you eat a lot of high fiber stuff. So it scrapes the walls of the GI. And then the goal is to walk about 30 minutes a day and keep your BMI or body mass index under 25. But you can see the process here again. So things like reactive oxygen species, carcinogens, oxidative stress gets into your body. They cause DNA damage. And that's also part of metabolism, right? So physical activity increases detoxifying those things, right? Physical activity helps speed up DNA repair, which stops the DNA damage. Physical activity helps regulate hormone, so it helps stop the changes. Okay? So you can see physical activity has a huge influence in lots of things that actually cause disease. So it turns up activities that help correct DNA damage, to help stop initiation or progression of cancers. And then here you can see just an example. I thought this was a really good example from an epidemiological study, but lifetime physical activity and risk of endometrial cancer. You can see that of 472 women, the most active women had the lower risk of endometrial cancers. So the big picture here is, why can't we cure everything? We know the causes, we know what's going on inside the cell, but why can't we cure it? And it kind of goes back to that slide I showed you in the very first of the cancer videos, and it's that you have over 200 cells in your body. I mean, we have all these factors I've been talking about for the last half hour of things that can cause cancers. When you mix them together, there's so many potential cancers, so many potential causes and types of cancers that it's impossible for us to identify and cure one cancer completely.